When you hear Neil Young's early work, the country influence is not extremely obvious. But I think, as it was with Bob Dylan and, say, Gene Clark of the Byrds, and all of the Byrds, really, and some of the Lovin' Spoonful, he would have heard a good amount of it growing up. Because radio in those days, I think, arguably, was more diverse for the average listener, the average young kid, the average teenager back then. As an example of someone unpredictable from a country background who could have influenced Neil Young, I think Don Gibson should be named. He's actually named on the back of Buffalo Springfield, but most obviously you don't have to do detective work because Neil Young covers Don Gibson's "Oh Lonesome Me" on After the Gold Rush, a great version, I think. And I think it's a great example of how Neil Young and also some other rock artists, they could draw inspiration from those country artists without imitating them, without sounding like, oh, I'm going to show how hip I am, how deep my record collection is, because I'm going to do this thing that people think of as really out of date and square.
Everybody's going out and having fun. I'm just a fool for staying home and having fun. Now you say,
I can't get over how you set me free.
If you play Don Gibson's original version of "Oh Lonesome Me," which was a big pop hit, not just a country hit, a long time before After the Gold Rush, it's much different. It's really jovial and good time. It's almost like, well, she dumped me, but I'm going to go out and have a good time anyway. I'm going to be happy-go-lucky about it. I'm just going to put a smile on it. When you hear Neil Young's version, it's a dirge, and you really feel the heartbreak, like, oh man, things are hopeless now, and I'm a loser. It's very different.
Forget about the past, find someone new. I've thought of everything from the...
Well, of course, Young is a repository for all different types of music, and he would have heard a lot of country when he was young. He heard lots of country music. By the time we get to sort of 1971, 72, country music is probably one of the dominant commercial formats in rock music at that time, particularly in America. And Young went to Nashville to record Harvest, which turned out to be commercially his most successful album, probably his most commercially successful album to this day. And there we have, you know, Neil Young pursuing the country direction for the first time in earnest.
Neil Young's a smart guy. I mean, he was on the pulse of what was going on, and his influences are obviously things that were going on around him, and like all the rest of us, we were applying those kinds of sensibilities to what we were trying to do.
I wanna live, I wanna give. I've been a miner for a heart of gold. It's these expressions I never give.
There seems to be an idea that Neil Young maybe didn't jump on a bandwagon, but somehow he joined a movement called country rock, which had been started by the Byrds and by Dylan recording Nashville's Skyline, and which then, in terms of the trajectory of Neil's career, takes him to Nashville in 1971, where he records part of the Harvest album. I don't think that's actually true. I think that does Neil Young a disservice, because I think he was actually one of the pioneers of so-called country rock, and this country influence is there much, much earlier than the period that gives us Notorious Byrd Brothers and Sweetheart of the Rodeo and Dylan's Nashville Skyline. He's heard country music, you know, as a fairly young boy on the radio back in Canada, and he's been attracted to it. He's heard people like Johnny Cash, and there's a very strong country tinge to the first Buffalo Springfield album, which comes out in 1966, and therefore predates Gram Parsons joining the Byrds, and is recorded at a time when Dylan is still, you know, in the middle of the Wild Mercury sound and recording Blonde on Blonde, although he recorded that in Nashville, as we know. You know, it's not a country rock album. So I think Neil Young, in a way, hasn't had his due as a pioneer of country rock.
Neil Young's input into the growth of country rock may have been overlooked, but the country thread would weave its way through many of his albums with fluctuating prominence. In the 1980s, Neil Young refocused his main attentions back to the genre, having been inspired by another stalwart of country, Willie Nelson. Nelson's rebellious character, combined with his provocative songwriting, spoke to Young's way of thinking at the time, and he would feature heavily on the 1985 album Old Ways. The pair would go on to collaborate in the foundation of annual charity event Farm Aid, where they performed together on the same stage and continue to return each year. But Young's interests would not solely lie in traditional styles, and as music evolved during the 1970s, he would become inspired by a new subculture. While folk, country and rock and roll music had been the core of Neil Young's work for several years, when punk emerged from the underground in 1977, it appeared to pose a threat to the traditional and established styles of the time, something that Neil Young was very much a part of.
I'm hugely intrigued by Neil Young's fascination with punk rock, because on one level, he is part of what they are kicking against. He is this multi-millionaire rock star. He's living on this, however many thousand-acre ranch in California. He's part of this supergroup called Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, which in a way epitomizes not the musical self-indulgence of Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, but certainly the sybaritic self-indulgence of living that luxurious lifestyle. Although he was part of this, Neil Young at the same time was not part of it. He saw this energy, this irreverence, this desire to puncture pomposity wherever it existed. And he could identify with that. Despite being a multimillionaire on his ranch, he felt an affinity with this.
Young saw something in punk music that none of the others did. He saw himself as a youth. He saw the sense of abandonment that was in the music, which appealed to him greatly. Crosby, Stills, Nash, they just didn't get it. They thought it was musically inchoate, which it was, that these guys couldn't play. Crosby complained they're just nihilists, man. They're just nihilists, they know nothing about music. They wouldn't know a piece of music that bit them on the nose. And that was pretty much the attitude from his contemporaries.
While his contemporaries mocked, Neil's fascination with this new undercurrent of aggressive rock continued.
There's a massive difference between punk music in the UK and the US. The explosion of the Sex Pistols over here was seismic, but in the States it didn't make much of an impact. The Sex Pistols went to America and toured there, but basically broke up on the road, and America was terribly resistant to it.
In America, you have maybe, people sort of know, okay, there's this Ramones band, and there's this sort of like, okay, kind of 50s retro, going back to the roots type thing. And the idea of a 50s retro rock and roll culture was actually very well established by that time. So a lot of punk was seen to be as sort of slipping in the back door through that. Just a modern version of early rock and roll, sure, people can understand that.
So it was easy to be still complacent in the States, whereas in the UK, a lot of the people that were doing singer-songwriter country music, or country rock rather, and whatever else, the Eagles of this world, suddenly found in the UK that they weren't quite as popular as they once were. So by the time we get to the end of the 70s, we've got Young recording Rust Never Sleeps, which is album of the year all over the place, and it was his big commercial comeback and critical comeback at the same time. It was a key moment, I think, and on that record of course it starts and ends with Hey Hey My and My Hey Hey, and he dares to mention Johnny Rotten in the song. He's not only naming him, but in interviews he's saying that he actually likes punk. He says he doesn't necessarily fully understand it, and he doesn't feel that he can necessarily be part of it in any way because he's too old, but he realizes and appreciates the energy that goes into it.
It's a classic questioning moment. You could say it's a questioning moment that could only be talked about by somebody of that age at that time, but you have equivalent questioning moments just, down the line since then. It's sort of like, ooh, what was it all for? Then you have Neil Young's take on it, a song that invokes Presley and Johnny Rotten, Hey Hey My My, both parts, and puts it all together and acknowledges the fact that, it's not that rock is dead, but that a certain figure, Presley, obviously, is now gone. You have this new seeming generation coming up going like, to heck with you all, we didn't need you. What did it all mean? And do these people coming along going like, arr, and all that, do they have a point? And the thing about the song is that it's ultimately wonderfully, both parts of the song, is that it's wonderfully ambivalent in the end. It's a song that's basically saying that, again, to quote the most famous line, better to burn out than fade away. It goes down hard in the second half. It goes down fighting.
Neil Young's reaction to the upsurge in punk music in the late 70s, it was, in a way, a much more appropriate and intelligent one than a lot of other artists of his age. What Neil Young did was that he didn't try to sound like a punk or new wave artist, but he drew some lyrical inspiration from it, and to some degree, with Rust Never Sleeps, he used it to toughen up his music without trying to sound like a punk or new wave act.
And that's precisely what Neil Young did. Embracing the genre, if not completely giving way to it, Young brought in new wave punk rockers Devo for his film project Human Highway, to feed off their energetic art rock mentality, while also utilizing their discordant sounds and satirical social commentary for his own development.
I think Neil Young also, for somebody who walks around all the time in flannel shirts and jeans, I think, the get-ups and, the costumes and all of this stuff, I think he got a big kick out of it. I think he liked the music. I think he thought it was interesting and smart and a new direction.
What a day.
Devo were of great interest to Neil Young because he saw there's something new which he didn't quite understand. And he decided to get the band Devo involved in his film Human Highway. And they appeared kind of doing sort of parodies, pastiches, well, with more parodies of songs like After the Gold Rush, where they'd put their own strange lyrics in, which were partly making fun of Neil's song at the same time, but I mean, with his sense of humour, he welcomed that kind of thing. They played these songs in a way which was kind of grungy, I suppose. I mean, it predated grunge in a sense. It was all very rough and ready, much more even than Crazy Horse had been. They sped up songs, they'd used different rhythms. It was odd. I mean, Neil Young, it greatly appealed to him. And most famously of all, of course, they came up with the title Rust Never Sleeps. I mean, two members of Devo had worked for an ad company, and part of the ad campaign was for a rust inhibitor, and they came up with the slogan "Rust Never Sleeps." And Young thought that was the perfect phrase to sum up his entire career, and probably Crosby, Stills and Ashes too, and everybody else. This whole thing about erosion, and you have to keep it fresh, and you have to keep it moving, and that was what Neil Young's musical philosophy and career philosophy was all about. It was this idea of longevity and keeping it going and refreshing it and trying something new. And Devo, injected that sense of spontaneity in him and made him look at his work and try and come up with a new way of thinking.
Young's alignment with Devo provided more than just a fresh way of thinking. Their breed of new wave music, infusing punk aesthetics with electronic textures, would lead Neil onto his most ambitious album yet, 1982's Trans.
It's not like Trans is a Devo album. Of course, it's a much different album. It's a much more melancholic album. It's a very, very personal album, as opposed to a, quirkily impersonal album, as you could say, is a lot of what Devo were doing. Something like Trans is much more in line with the obvious melancholia of something like Kraftwerk, who were the forebears of this particular sound, who had a lot of other bands coming after them, who were starting to sort of play around with the ideas of sort of like, okay, electronics as something that's pop but melancholic, something that's sort of like, downbeat as much as it can be catchy.